The 2025 NFL trade deadline has passed, and the Las Vegas Raiders made no moves, no trades, no big changes. Some people are questioning whether this was a mistake. There's even a report, though I'm not entirely sure if it's true, that the Raiders didn't even make any calls to other teams. Instead, they turned down offers from teams looking to buy their players. So what does this mean for the Raiders moving forward? Let's talk about it. First off, I don't think the Raiders are a terrible team. I believe the issue lies in coaching. If the Raiders swapped out their head coach and kept everything else the same, they'd be a better team overall. We might not win the Super Bowl right away, but we'd be a much more competitive team with a stronger coach. From the head coach to the offensive coordinator, even down to the position coaches. For example, the offensive line has struggled, and it's been poorly coached. I'd argue that this year, the running backs have had their own challenges, not necessarily because of the position coach, but maybe due to the scheme or the offensive coordinator. Now, the Raiders did make a few changes this season, and we'll get into those later. But for now, let's talk about the trade deadline and what it means for the team. We saw other teams, like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who traded for defensive end Preston Smith from the Green Bay Packers. The New York Jets let go of wide receiver Mike Williams, who also joined the Steelers. Even the Rams were making moves, trading away a cornerback to the Baltimore Ravens. Meanwhile, the Raiders stood still. Some teams are clearly trying to improve their rosters and make a run for the Super Bowl this year, while others, like the Saints, are looking to offload players. The Saints, for example, traded away Marshawn Lattimore, one of the top cornerbacks in the NFL. It's a sign that those teams are rebuilding and focusing on the future. But the Raiders didn't make any moves like that. Does that mean they're tanking? Not necessarily. It could mean the Raiders understand that making the playoffs this year is unlikely, but they also believe their team isn't too far off from competing. The Raiders aren't in the same position as teams like the Saints or Panthers, who are clearly in rebuild mode. The Raiders have talent, and they don't need to sell players to reset. In fact, one of the few things the Raiders have done right under general manager Dave Ziegler and head coach Josh McDaniels is managing the salary cap well and not overspending. They've been careful with contracts, and they've avoided handing out big, unnecessary deals that could hurt the team in the long run. Looking ahead, the Raiders are in a solid financial position, with projections showing they could have around $110 million in cap space next year. That's not a bad spot to be in for a team that already has decent talent. While the Raiders aren't a bad team, they're also not far from becoming a legitimate contender. If the Raiders had a top coach like Andy Reid, I believe they could be a Super Bowl contender in a few years, as long as they get the quarterback position right. The team already has good pieces, but they need a little fine-tuning and maybe a couple more key players. The draft has been a mixed bag, but there's no denying the team has found some solid players like Max Crosby, who has turned out to be one of the best defensive ends in the league. They've also had some lucky breaks, like bringing in cornerback Jordan Bennett, who looks like he might become one of the Raiders' top players in the secondary. The Raiders have solid building blocks, but they still need a quarterback and a few more pieces. Running backs are less of a priority, since the NFL is full of talented backs, and teams can find solid ones without spending a lot. Despite what some people say, I don't think the Raiders are a bad football team. The fact that they didn't trade away key players like Colton Miller shows they're not looking to tear down the roster. There's still hope for the future, and as long as they keep making smart moves, they'll be in good shape. The Raiders are in an interesting spot following the trade deadline. They didn't make any moves, and that decision reveals a lot about where they think they stand. Some fans and analysts expected them to either bring in new talent or move on from some players to stack future assets. Yet, no deals were made, not because of lack of opportunity. Reportedly, the Raiders received calls from teams interested in their players but declined the offers, indicating they aren't in a rebuilding mindset, Las Vegas's confidence in the current roster is evident. While they may not be immediate Super Bowl contenders, this isn't a team in disarray. The main issue seems to be coaching rather than talent. Many believe a stronger coaching staff, from the head coach down to positional assistants, could elevate this squad. With a more effective game plan and in-game adjustments, the Raiders could turn close games into wins and potentially aim for playoff contention soon. Other NFL teams showed contrasting approaches at the deadline. The Steelers, for example, acquired pass rusher Preston Smith from the Packers and wide receiver Mike Williams from the Jets, clearly signaling their intent to compete. Likewise, teams like the Rams and Ravens made strategic moves, with the Rams trading away a cornerback and the Ravens adding defensive depth. These teams are looking to either make a playoff push or prepare for a long-term rebuild by bringing in draft capital. Yet the Raiders' decision to stand pat suggests a different approach. While the Saints offloaded key players like Marshawn Lattimore for cap relief, the Raiders are not facing the same financial strain. Thanks to the restraint of GM Dave Ziegler and head coach Josh McDaniels, the team has managed the cap well. Unlike some teams that have had to offload players to make room, Las Vegas has flexibility. They're expected to have around $110 million in cap space next season, setting them up to add more talent without losing key players. Looking ahead, the Raiders seem optimistic about their core roster. With a few adjustments, particularly at quarterback, they believe they can be competitive. If they address coaching and make a few targeted acquisitions, this team could be in the playoff conversation sooner than some might expect.